Die Diaspora spricht.
Parlando.
Diasporas
Conoscere. Falando. Diasporas
Govori.
de parler.
Diaspora spricht.
Diasporas Speaking.
Përshëndetje, my name is Rina Limoni and I'm the host of Diasporas Speaking. In this episode, I am joined by Dr. Ervin Malakaj. Together, we explore how queerness, diaspora, and cultural memory intersect, and how speaking, writing, and remembering become vital acts of survival, resistance, and belonging. Welcome to Diasporas Speaking, Ervin.
Thanks so much for having me.
As you might have heard, I start each conversation with 3 questions. Where are you from? Where did you grow up? And what do you do in your day-to-day?
So I spent my formative years, and here I mean, childhood and teenage, in 3 different cultural contexts. And I think each one of them means quite a lot to me in different ways. And I like to say that I have at least three hometowns. So I was born and raised in the former Yugoslavia, in Doboj. I come from a Muslim family who fled the war in the 1990s. I lived in Germany, and my family lived in Germany as refugees, and we lived in a city named Wiesbaden, where I went to primary school and high school. And then we immigrated into the United States, and there I lived in Chicago. So I finished high school there, I went to college in Chicago, and from there on, spent quite a lot of time in the US before eventually moving to Canada. My professional day-to-day, I work as a professor at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, and I specialize in German studies, German cultural history specifically. I'm also interested in queer and media studies as sort of sub-disciplines. And I have quite a lot of interest more recently in diaspora studies and how diaspora studies interacts with queer studies. Hence also my interest and my being a big fan of your podcast. I'm so grateful to be in conversation with you.
You know, when I first invited you for this episode, I told a friend and then I told them your name, and he was like, Malakaj, doesn't sound Bosnian to me. And then I said, well, it sounds Bosnian to me because he's Bosnian. And then when we talked, you told me that you have a connection to Kosovo.
My grandfather on my father's side is from Prizren, from Kosovo himself. And my, sort of Bosnian background, my personal family background, is very much entwined with this history, this personal history and attachment to Kosovo too. But it was really interesting because I never really thought of these sort of, like broader lineages and connections to specific cultural contexts when I was growing up, when I was a child. In fact, the really interesting anecdote that you bring into our conversation today was something that I faced in high school quite a lot, although it was not quite as gentle. It wasn't in a good context. When I was surrounded by a bunch of post-Yugoslavian diaspora people in high school, specifically Bosnians, and this was when my family moved to Chicago, they questioned my last name in a similar kind of way. They're like, what is this last name? Where is this from? And it's kind of part and parcel of this sort of Balkan culture. I'm fairly certain you know what I mean with this, where Balkan people tend to want to divine who people are and where they come from based on their names, based on their looks and stuff. I find that sometimes endearing and sometimes really, really discomforting. I should say that in my personal context and my lived experience in high school, it wasn't a very pleasant thing, actually. I actually started to feel a little bit, that's one of the areas where I started to feel different from other people, where the sort of like some of the Bosnian diaspora community didn't necessarily reject me on the basis of this name and this sort of connection to Kosovo, but rather there was always this kind of like sense of their suspicion with regard to me. There was something that they didn't quite fully take as quality about me that helps them understand me as component part of this broader Bosnian community in the early 2000s in Chicago. There was this feeling of like, oh, is he Bosnian? What kind of Bosnian is he? I've never heard that name. And to me, actually this name, and this sort of like background of mine as it kind of interacted with the broader Bosnian diaspora community was one of the early lessons about the vicissitudes of belonging and diaspora. So yeah, I appreciate that you have this wonderful way of relating to this last name because you're like, oh, there's something about this last name that's not quite Bosnian. But on the flip side, it can also, and it was used pretty negatively with regard to how I experienced my upbringing in Chicago in the Bosnian diaspora community.
When we spoke and planned this episode, your positionality as being a Bosnian for what is perceived unusual last name for people and how it is framed, unfortunately not self-described on this occasion, had an impact on your positionality and how you evolved. But then for you, another layer, positionality and how you related to the Bosnian diaspora or to the Balkan diaspora came when you outed yourself. This added an othering, perhaps a distancing effect from the community.
I think actually in these moments when there are people who don't quite conform to expected behaviors and embodiments, it becomes kind of like an invitation to renegotiate community. At least that's kind of like a generous way that I can look at that question. But it was a really challenging process for me, to be perfectly honest. Growing up queer, coming into my own understanding of my queerness and coming to love myself as a queer person was a really challenging and long road, and in no small part because the only time that queerness was brought up around me in this broader diaspora community was in a negative way. So homosexuality or queer gender expression were slurs. They were the worst of sins and the highest of offenses to your family name. So there were quite a lot of negative things that were attached to me, to queerness as such. And honestly, I learned from my interaction with the broader Bosnian diaspora community in Chicago that queerness really had no place in it. Or at least that's how I perceived it. Queer people were not the stuff of community. They would be the target of harassment and bullying were they to claim their queerness publicly and with pride. And so I learned that if I wanted to stay safe, I had to avoid speaking too much about who I was for as long as I could. It meant like a half-closeted life or a sort of don't ask, don't tell type of mentality in my teenage years, where some people knew and I came out to them in really sort of direct ways, and others knew through indirect fashion, but I never felt comfortable leaning into my queerness publicly. And honestly, it's really hilarious to me that, from my vantage point today, that the Bosnian diaspora community into which I was positioned at the time rejected queerness, given how prone to, this is my personal take, how prone to access Bosnians can be. And access to me is one way that I describe my queerness. And with that, I mean, the idea of exceeding the categories that are imposed upon you, like you exceed them, you're filled with access. And honestly, I felt that that could have been an avenue through which I could have developed quite a lot of shared experiences with some of those people at the time. To this day, I still believe that and I hope that this shared access can eventually bring us together. And I'm trying to think quite a lot of different ways through which I can maybe facilitate that in my own sort of scholarly and community work.
And then it's not absolute that you're not part of a community. Clearly, it's just, unfortunately, not only peculiar to the Bosnian diaspora, but something similar I can observe also in the Albanian diaspora abroad. And something that really warmed my heart when we spoke was how you brought up women, strong women in your life, particularly your grandmother, the matriarch, and her role in your life and for you. And something that you underlined was finding community through faith and the love that you received from your grandmother.
So I can maybe tell a little bit of a story of one of the first Ramadans when my family moved to Chicago. So this was in the late 90s, early 2000s. And this first Ramadan was rather challenging and for a very, very personal reason. I can't attest to this being the case for others, but this was how I experienced it. So I grew up in not a very, I wouldn't say a very religious, nor I don't know how much religion really did play a big part in the day-to-day of my family. So this context in which I grew up was not very much dictated by religiosity, but it was nonetheless a Muslim household. It wasn't a practicing household as such, but I was aware of my sort of belonging to this faith-based, group. And some people around me in high school were fasting during Ramadan, as one does. And they were very curious as to why I was not, despite my self-identification as a Muslim person. And it was a little bit of a pushback from some of those people. And these were sort of like individuals around me in school and by extension, some of their family members. So, you have this story we just talked about my last name, we have my queerness. And then there was this, what I think was perceived to be a lack of respect to official faith practice through my sort of like not fasting that came to be perceived as signs for some that I just did not belong in this community. So that I was doing quite a lot of things wrong or not the way that was expected. And I started to feel it was really weighing down on me because I couldn't connect to this group of people that, on paper should be a natural place for me to find some sort of belonging. We were all Bosnian diaspora teenagers and we ought to find a way to one another, right? But that didn't really work out for me in that way. And my grandmother, I recall this very fondly, was a really important source of comfort for me on these matters. She was a devout Muslim woman her entire life, and she, to me, kind of embodied some of the best aspects of faith, and she taught me quite a lot of lessons about it. So, for instance, she would regularly instruct me not to worry about what other people want and what they expect from me, and in particular when it comes to faith-based practice. So she would say things like, "Oh, don't worry about it, I'll fast for you. You don't have to do this." There's not for her this understanding of religion as something that resembles a disciplinary apparatus. So religion was not something that, projects a discipline onto others, but religion and faith were really important ways by which to express love, express care, and express community to others. And so she tried to reframe some of my own concerns during my teenage years away from understanding of faith as this thing that tells you what to do and understanding faith as an invitation to think about how to better love, care, and be in community with others. For her, at least, and this is one of the major lessons, you can hold someone in your prayers, but you do so because you love them. You could fast for someone because you care about them. And you do these things not because you dislike them, right? Like you do these things and you activate faith because you deeply care for someone else. So today I don't have practical connection to faith, I should say, but I do have access to these lessons about loving others and caring for others that I learned through my family's own sort of faith practice, including my grandmother's. And to me, extending such love and care is part of faith work. It's kind of like my own sort of personal faith work, even if it is once removed from established faith practice. And maybe I'll just end with one quick example. So my grandma was really a great source of lessons about what it means to love other people and how to love other people. And I really think this is grounded in her own faith. So she's had a beautiful garden in front of her house where if she invited you over for coffee or she got to know you through some fashion or another and she liked you, she'd invite you to plant a tulip in her garden. And she would basically take care of this tulip. And then once the tulip blossoms in the spring, she'd tell you about it. She'd make sure to tend to the tulip. And she had this like small little tulip garden of all the people who she cared for and loved. And it was just one way for her to express care for others and love for others. But for me, it was also a great lesson about an investment in other people, and that love and care is actually an investment, and it is something that one can dedicate one's entire life to. And those were kind of these lessons that helped replace some of the negative experiences that I had with regards to faith in some of these diaspora contexts into which I was positioned, which weren't always nurturing. So I had this like great counterbalance to some of those negative experiences.
That's such a precious way and such a precious story you just shared with us. But in this finding the community through your grandmother and through love and care, that can be empowering. And what I found empowering in your story is how you use language and culture as an everyday act of resistance. What does it mean to be a queer Muslim, and how is that positionality empowering towards strictly given definitions of faith?
This is a question I think about quite a lot, and it's recently been even more important to me than it has in the past. But maybe I'll start by talking a little bit about the surrounding I grew up in again. And so here, I don't necessarily mean my family, but the broader social network of diaspora, which I usually, when I talk to other people about this, I let them know that this sort of broader social network of the diaspora oftentimes cast me as a sort of impossible or improbable subject. You know, there are a couple of these sort of like sayings that circulate. There are these things that people say. For instance, quote, there is no homosexuality kod nas, or rather in our circles. Another one is nema to u Bosni. That doesn't exist in Bosnia. Like this notion of sort of negating the very existence of queerness as something that is from outside, that could not potentially be within our circles. And to me, there were always acts of very severe violence. They delineate a very firm line of belonging. They dehumanize queerness. They cast queerness as some sort of anomaly. There's kind of like an exceptionalism of queerness that gets sort of treated as a threat. And really the sort of reactionary idea here is to silence queerness, to try to erase or negate queerness. And honestly, I sometimes get this feeling that there's this like an fantasy of wanting to eradicate queers and queerness from public consciousness, and particularly from sort of like diaspora consciousness, and very much wanting to not even have conversations about what it is for queer people to be part of the broader diaspora community. So each expression of this sort, and here I mean this notion of nema to kod nas, that doesn't exist in our midst, to me contains almost like a sort of genocidal wish that queer people be eradicated. And it's really, really, really sad to me, and it's very scary to me. And for many years, to be perfectly honest, I was very much repulsed by the constant barrage of anti-queerness in this diaspora community, that I just wanted nothing to do with this community. I avoided it wherever I could. I ignored requests to be in community with people who actually sometimes reached out to me. I just wanted to be in contexts that taught me how to love myself and draw strength from who I was, and not contexts that constantly positioned me to second guess who I was and to doubt who I was, and wanted me to sort of erase or negate who I was. But then I realized how much this sort of like self-isolation fed into the logic of eradication to which I was subjected. So this idea of like me leaving and not wanting to be in this community was a kind of like positioning of myself out of sight and out of mind, and in a way I helped these sort of like the worst ideas around queerness vis-a-vis diaspora. I kind of confirmed that people like me did not exist, right? Like by removing myself from this context, I was kind of feeding very much into some of the worst understandings of it and some of its worst logics. And I should say at the same time, the sort of whatever the non-diaspora community or culture around me was, and this is really an experience that I face to this day, doesn't really know how to respond to my background as a queer Muslim person either. For some people around me who did not think much about my positionality previously, I honestly am nothing more than a sort of like simplified version of a tortured queer who suffers under my affiliation to the label Muslim or something, which also wasn't true, To me, these are, and here I mean these sort of experiences in a non-diaspora community, in the sort of like broader mainstream mainstream culture. These are everyday acts of anti-Muslim racism, and they're, I think, component parts of mainstream queer culture in North America and Europe, if not beyond. And they too prevent me from being able to talk about some of the struggles I faced in my own communities because I did not want to feed their stereotypes. And so there was a little bit of this double bind of queer Muslim Bosnian diasporicity, where you oftentimes have to fashion a context in which you can articulate who you are for yourself. And you cannot always draw on the resources from either of those two separate cultural contexts. My initial response to mainstream culture was to keep who I was concealed at all times. So again, like this sort of like semi-closeting. So meaning, I would come out as queer and I would be a queer person, but I wouldn't tell people around me what my actual background was, what my complete or fuller background was. But again, as you know, this too did nothing by way of protecting me or making me feel good about myself. So very recently, and I think this is the part that I really would like to expand upon, also beyond this podcast, and perhaps get into more extensive conversation with other queer people in the diaspora. I started articulating who I was in all professional settings. And here I mean my full self. So sort of like a renewed coming out as like a sort of queer Bosnian Muslim, this sort of self-proclamation of who I was, a positionality statement that kind of prefaced anything that I was doing in public life. And I, at times, noticed that this was very discomforting for other people, that this discomfort, that this articulation of who I am generates is somehow a problem for others. But I realized that it's nowhere near the discomfort that I feel when I conceal my background in conversations. And then a couple of other things started happening. So this reclamation of my queer Muslim diasporic identity through various public and private speech acts has been really, really transformational. Usually those around me, they're kind of jolted a little bit by it. And I'd like to believe that each one of those jolts becomes kind of like a prompt for people to reflect a little bit on their ignorance and do a little bit better in the future. But most importantly, these sort of like self-proclamations help find me ways to other people in the diaspora and beyond who support me, who are interested in what I do. Reclaiming who I was helped me see the complex tapestry that is Bosnian diaspora culture, and also the broader culture that lies beyond the mainstream, which contains also many different types of people and experiences, which often depart from those I met during my formative years. And so through the reclamation of my background, I also realized there is a lot I have to learn, right? Like I've sort of like in protecting myself from negative experiences that I've sustained in the past, I've come up with really sort of like absolutist ways that I in the past related to, for instance, the Bosnian community. And now I'm starting to unlearn some of my own sort of toxicity with regard to some of these like defensive ways that I've become very defensive in the past about my relation to the Bosnian community. Anyway, so what I'm doing now is like through this reclamation of, queer Bosnian Muslim diaspora subjectivity, I'm kind of positioning myself to learn more about my own history, about the history of my people, and honestly about ongoing discourse in the diaspora and queer diaspora community.
speak about a reclamation, but what I read in your story is being constantly on the margin, whether it is in your community or whether it is from the mainstream culture or I would say, the dominant culture, using antagonisms as a critical stance to move the body in a space that displaces you for a second time. And I'm speaking here of Germany. You also told me that you use certain words or certain framings in the German context as well.
I'll bring up one example, and this example is perhaps a minor example, but I do think it illustrates well what you are addressing here. And it has to do with a certain kind of an attempt in the academy, in particular in a German academy, to try to get certain terms right. And here, I'll just give you the example and by way of illustrating what I mean here. So in German academic settings, which I professionally, traverse a lot, I introduce myself as a former Flüchtling or refugee or Flüchtlingskind, child refugee. In Germany. And this is grown to be really intentional on my part. And in progressive settings, particularly, I'm often corrected by very well-meaning people about my use of the term Flüchtling or refugee. There's been a sort of like move in recent years in a German intellectual discourse to basically call attention to the system that basically produces the identity category of the Flüchtling. And one way to better capture that than to simply call yourself a Flüchtling is to call yourself a geflüchtete Person. So a person who fled or who sought refuge. And for some people in a sort of like academic context, this is a much more preferred, even a sort of like more correct way of expressing a particular kind of identity category. But to me, this revision of, Flüchtling to geflüchtete Person really does nothing, like as a person who's actually lived through this. In fact, I find that this erases the violence that was done to me, my family. Flüchtling for me is a very intimate part of who I remember being. And this is part of the vocabulary that has always kind of haunted me, that I'm now trying to deploy very, very intentionally. I also noticed that this notion of Geflüchtete as a linguistic practice seems to provide quite a lot of comfort to German progressives and in their circles. Hence, the sort of like wanting to correct me in the way that I'm kind of articulating what is often perceived to be vulgar language or vulgar use of language. And honestly, I have absolutely no interest in comforting progressives in German intellectual circles or academic discourses or academic logics as such. Sort of discomfort does nothing for me to help me understand my lived experience better. And I find that the comfort prevents those people who seek to establish a particular kind of culture of exchange from accessing any relevant information they might like about me. But when I insist on Flüchtling, people are very much bothered. And in fact, in academic settings, my insistence on it unveils quite a lot of resentments that these people have veiled about refugees in Germany, which were kind of, these resentments were located behind all the comfort that these people were trying to facilitate all along. So my Flüchtling usage becomes a prompt of sorts for them and for me to recognize the uneven power dynamic in these conversations. And I'm hoping that by sort of generating discomfort, I am potentially helping lead others to better relations, but also challenge myself to constantly renegotiate these relations with the people that I find in Germany. People don't always act on discomfort in an ideal way. I think that producing discomfort in academic settings is really, really important because I think that this discomfort tethers those in a room who rather use comforting language to talk about really discomforting things that some of us experience, kind of tethers them to a situation in which they need to reflect on their own relationship to the subject matter. And I like to think that this discomfort is some of the good work that has to be done, if only by way of leveling the ground for, I should note that German academia always discomforts me, and I kind of want to make sure that we're all kind of, either we're all going to be discomforted in it, or I'm not going to be part of certain conversations. I should note that I was really not meant to be in academia, in particular in Germany. In fact, had my family been able to stay in Germany, which we were not, I don't believe I would have ever been able to go to the university there. And so I always kind of harbor a particular kind of resentment and also a particular kind of suspicion vis-a-vis this infrastructure there. And there is this like early assortment process in German elementary education and the sort of like general anti-migrant resentments there that prevented many people like me from going to the university. My dad reminds me of this regularly, and I'm very grateful he does. And then each time that I enter a German educational context, I remember this. And so when I face somebody from a sort of like German majoritarian context correcting me in how I am articulating myself, I very much need to intervene from my current position of power because this is something that I can do now that I wasn't able to do in the past. And so like insisting on a kind of like maybe a little bit more of a combative relation to the German academy feels very affirmative for me in this current moment.
You mentioned power dynamics and you mentioned violence towards the Flüchtling. Germany displaced you for a second time. You moved to Germany, fleeing war from Bosnia with your family. But then, as I know the story of many Bosnian people in Germany, they were returned, but there was simply nowhere to return in Bosnia. Practically, emotionally, and psychologically, what does it mean to be displaced twice, if that can even be answered at all?
It's a very good question and a very challenging question. I should note that I have to mention my parents, and I should note that my parents dealt with the brunt of the struggle of these moves that you mentioned. Yeah, to sort of like at least twice displaced, right? From the home country to Germany and then from Germany to the US. As for me, refugee life in Germany was incredibly challenging for various reasons, not least of which the notion of being, I hate to say it, but being thrown into elementary school without speaking the language and trying to negotiate something. And this was before there were any sort of programs that helped people acclimate to the educational setting there, right? And I am working through quite a lot of the lingering pain that is related to forced migration and refugee life in Germany in therapy today. And so, yeah, that sort of like first move was really, really challenging. The second move, this from Germany to the US, I have to say initially felt very exciting to me. I was a teenager when we moved from Germany to the US, and US culture was a very exciting thing to teenagers living in Germany in the late 1990s, and I was part of that enthusiasm. And I remember feeling very, very, very eager to make it to Chicago of all places, right? Like, I mean, I wasn't part of sort of like sports enthusiasm, but the 90s were like the big sort of like the big decade for the Chicago Bulls, and like everyone was talking about these things. And so I was all of a sudden the cool kid who gets to like move to the US and live in like a cool US city. But I should say that very quickly upon arriving in Chicago, my enthusiasm waned. And in no small part because of my high school experience in Chicago, where I met quite a lot of other Bosnians and was positioned in a Bosnian diaspora community, actually quite a lot more than I had ever known in Germany. I went to a school in Germany where there were very few, if any, other Bosnians, to going to a high school in Chicago where there were quite a lot of people from the Bosnian diaspora community. And I should say there is definitely a comfort in that too, right? Like you're moving to a new country and, being around so many other Bosnians in school was a resource. There was information sharing that took place about navigating the transition to yet another educational system. And these things were quite important. But then the social life, and I already intimated some of this in our previous conversations, the social life in high school, coupled with my lived experience as a queer person, led to quite a lot of issues too. And diaspora, to get to your question, like diaspora for some of us is this like multi-stop experience with multiple moves, meaning it's not always as easy as and I don't mean to devalue this experience, but it's not always as straightforward as, there's a home country and then there's a host country and a transition to it. There's quite a lot of complexity to the diaspora that reaches beyond that too, right? For some of us, it means very regular movement, even in the host country. And for yet others, it means resettlement one time after another. And since my life in Chicago, and this has a lot to do with my professional life as an academic, I've been on a move a lot. And, this means I lived in quite a lot of different contexts in the US. I returned to Germany on a number of occasions. Now I live in Canada. Some of my academic comrades like to attach a sort of romantic notion to such constant movement. For them, constantly moving, you're always, meeting new people, you're getting to know new settings, you're constantly active. And honestly, I think there is a truth to that. Yet others in sort of like more politically oriented contexts think that this sort of like constant movement helps you evade some of the disciplinary apparatuses, of the state. I don't know how true that is. I just know that I don't like movement. I dislike it. I just want to rest. I feel constantly tired. And when I think even back on my own familial history and my personal history with forced displacement and also different types of movements beyond that, it's just one resettlement after another, and I don't find always strength in that. I actually find quite a lot of fatigue in it, or I locate fatigue in it.
I feel like this sense of security, I need that. When you mentioned this constant movement makes you tired, perhaps that is also a consequence how we fled. And there is, as you said, nothing romantic about that. But I want to know, when you touched upon this for a bit, how is your relationship with Germany today?
It's a very challenging question. So I find that Germany has always been as a sort of like state for me. It's always been resentful of me and my people and so many others. There are, my view, quite a lot of histories of humiliation, dehumanization, and trauma of people's relationship to Germany as a host country for the diaspora life. And I always remembered this in my ongoing work in Germany. I should note that I have quite a lot of strong connections to Germany for various reasons, professionally and personally. And when I return on regular research trips, for instance, to Germany, for instance, last summer or even coming up this summer, I usually spend a couple of months, if not longer, in Germany, then I always do so with some reservation. I return to Germany often with quite a lot of privilege, right? And there is a safety net of knowing I don't have to stay there. I go as a professional with a professional affiliation, with professional funding structures. This means that I can be in Germany in ways that I was not always able to or not at all able to be in Germany in my childhood, right? But the pain of that experience as a refugee, as a Flüchtlingskind in Germany, is such an important part of me. It will never not be a part of me. And it reminds me to be careful there, to watch out. It's kind of like a ghost that haunts you, but one of those good ghosts that reminds you to be suspicious of much that happens in Germany. For honestly, there are many false, very deceptive structures that seek to conscript you, and this has certainly been the case for me. And I don't necessarily just mean the recent political shifts in Germany, which are atrocious, and I'm really, really scared of what's to come. But it's also like I remain suspicious of Germany's progressive politics too, progressive configurations of community articulations. And I think it has quite a lot to do with the lived experience that I bring to this conversation around Germany, right? I think for different people, they relate differently to Germany because they've had a different experience to it. One example is my partner, whom I love a great deal, who's an American who has accompanied me to Germany on quite a lot of trips. He experienced Germany completely differently than I do. For him, it's a different experience, and that's because he didn't have this background that I had, and I'm grateful that he doesn't in a lot of ways. So he can maintain a sort of more generous and perhaps also a little bit more of a romanticized relationship to Germany, whereas I can't. I should say though, it's not that I don't have any friends, family members in Germany. Of course I do. There are people to whom I have found my way in no small part because I shared who I was. I shared my own sort of suspicions and resentments vis-a-vis Germany. And that sort of was a bridge to other people, for they too felt very similar things. And so there are some community configurations that from which I draw quite a lot of strength. But for the most part, I cannot shake this suspicion, this resentment, this kind of feeling bad when I'm in Germany. It's just always part of my experience there.
And that is understandable considering how one grows up in Germany as an Ausländer. I will follow
Oh
your
yeah.
tradition with claiming words
Oh
as
yeah.
antagonisms, as a Flüchtling, as an Ausländer. And that leaves a trace in you, even for myself. But we will move to the next point of this conversation, something that I really look forward to discussing with you, because I found it so empowering when you said writing yourself into history. You said it in our previous conversation, and you mentioned this today as well. With this point, there comes a question about your memoir. You're currently writing on your memoir, not to reveal the title. I'm going to leave it to you. But what's triggered you to write a memoir?
I'm very glad to talk about this. It's been a really important project for me, and it's been I think a material manifestation or articulation of my sort of like reclamation of my own queer Muslim Bosnian diaspora, subjectivity. And a lot of that has to do with what I mentioned just a bit ago, this notion of sort of within a diaspora community, sort of like this wishful thinking of, queerness doesn't exist here. It's not a thing. It's a thing that the kids catch in the, diaspora. And it's what we need to just protect our diaspora kids from, from learning these sort of like things.
It's
It's
important.
imported, right? It's an import into the diaspora community. And I just felt like that always kind of like earlier I mentioned this notion of like and it always kind of evoked for me an understanding of myself as an impossible subject or an improbable subject, and this notion of like there isn't a discursive field through which I can articulate my own experience, because just articulating it through sort of queer mainstream culture doesn't work. Just articulating it through diaspora culture doesn't work. So it was this notion of like wanting to discover language for myself through which to write myself into this history where I feel like there are so many forces that don't want me to be part of that history. And so I kind of want to reclaim and lean into my experience as a queer Bosnian Muslim. I find that our stories are not often told, and there are quite a lot of us. There are so many wonderful people that I've met in a queer Bosnian Muslim diaspora. And I am writing this sort of book of essays slash memoir about life in a queer Bosnian diaspora. And I kind of want it to be like an invitation to others like me to think with me about queer Bosnian Muslim diasporicity. And also those who are not like me, who might like to be in conversation about this topic. So kind of want to inspire others, in particular other queer people in the Bosnian Muslim diaspora and the Balkan diaspora writ large, to write more, to share their accounts in whatever format works for them. And I've developed what I like to think is a really good sort of concept to articulate this. The sort of like main title currently for the book of essays and slash memoir is a Tetka theory or anti-theory. And I find that Tetka theory as such kind of like articulates a really neat way by which to capture queer Bosnian Muslim diasporicity, but also it might be a framework for others through which to articulate their own version of this story.
What does queer Tetka theory mean in practice?
So this, I thought quite a lot about this. Like this was years in the making, right? But really like, in its basic form. So like I'm trying to think about something like called a Tetka style or like Tetka theory that to me seeks to describe a relation, right? Like more than a condition. So it's not like a sort of identity, but more like a sort of practice. And with that, what I mean is this, the language that we can develop in order to articulate how we relate to the world. And in Tetka style, this means drawing on whatever resources you can find around you in order to make it from one moment to the next in that narrative. Like whatever it is that you can grab onto. And to me, those resources are the things that you do that are good. And then so there are good resources, there are also really bad resources. And so Tetka advice, for instance, is super adorable. It always wants to come from a place of love, but it can also be super toxic. It could be misplaced, it can mislead, it can doesn't always have to be a sort of like romanticized practice of coming to understand who you are and your relation to others. And so I'm trying to hold on to this imperfect quality of information seeking about striving and survival and want to articulate it from within my own experience by way of kind of describing this Tetka style of like there isn't like a handbook on how to be a queer Bosnian Muslim in the diaspora. You know, it's not like there's like a brochure somewhere on an official website, right? In fact, a lot of the information and resources you basically have to reinvent and develop for yourself. And then like 3 years later realize, oh, other people have written about this too, you know? And the idea really is that there is this sort of like mode of relating to the world. It's just about constant self-study and a study of my environments by way of developing whatever resource I can for myself in order to make it from today to tomorrow. And here I mean Tetka Theory, again, like that really does not want to romanticize the Tetka figure. It's also not about my Tetka. Like, you know, I have my own Tetka. I have my aunties and I love my Tetka. It's not about my actual aunt, whom I really, truly love dearly. But it's about the figure of the Tetka and this Tetka style that interests me, which is, I think, a really great way of capturing the logics of the queer Bosnian diaspora, to which I was exposed and in which I participated and in which I continue to participate.
You speak about a mode of relating to the world. I don't know whether you feel comfortable, but can you reveal one curious story from your book?
I'd be glad to, but I should note that, you know, the journey I took to write the book and there were actually quite a lot of journeys, like actual journeys. I had to travel. So this journey was really transformative for me. It was very painful and it was quite triggering as well. And I talk a little bit about the process itself in the book too. And one reason for the pain is that I personally struggle with memory and remembering and live with severe memory loss as a result of some of my personal struggles with trauma. So I had to basically go and dig things up, as it were, and, find information, only to realize just how little there is to dig up in some instances, or how much there is to be discovered in ways that I hadn't expected before, or how severe some of my experiences were in the past, which I completely repressed and pushed to the side. One segment of a chapter in Tetka Theory deals with my recent trip to Xanten, Germany, which is a small town near Cologne. Most people are unfamiliar with it, but if you've lived there, you know it well. It's an old Roman fort, but it's also the alleged birthplace of the mythological Germanic hero Siegfried from the Nibelungen, if you're familiar with it. But Xanten was also the home of a large multi-complex refugee camp. And this camp was repurposed from old military barracks, which were no longer in use, and over the course of the last 3 decades or so, if not longer, was used as a temporary or long-term housing for one refugee generation in Germany to another. In the 1990s, a bunch of people from the former Yugoslavia, and this included my family, were housed there. So I kind of learned as much as I could about this history of this refugee camp. I myself am not writing a history of this refugee camp because I don't have the skills. I'm not a historian, and I would actually like to put this as a challenge to my historian comrades. If they're looking for a project to take up, I would love for some of them to take a look at this refugee camp and attempt to write some of the histories about it, because it's super, super important. Anyways, for me, for my own project, I used this sort of like journey to Xanten, which is no longer in my memory, but is in a family memory. And so meaning my parents told me I went there. So I don't remember being there, but my parents remember. And so in my chapter, I relate this journey of going back and trying to reconstruct as much as I can from my own sort of like personal experience, using sometimes memories that are not memories, if that makes any sense. Like I don't have memories of being there, but I kind of have these like shadow memories of knowing I was there. And so I try to intervene or interweave my own sort of like relating to this bizarre place that is called Xanten by reflecting on the bizarre scenario that is a humongous refugee camp being positioned in this tiny ancient town village that also is the mythological birthplace of like the Germanic hero. Like it's just so bizarre to me that like, and you know, today as tourists who go to Xanten, you would not know that there is a huge refugee complex there because you go there to like meet Siegfried, right? And like learn about Siegfried and Germanic something or another. But quite a lot of us also had this kind of like shadow experience there of like of being part of what is ostensibly a humongous refugee infrastructure. And I try to articulate a little bit of the excitement, but also the severe discomfort of what it was like to learn that and learn this history about Xanten that I did not know about when I was there. I'm hoping this does something by way of inspiring others to kind of reflect a little bit about some of these like childhood experiences they've made in these refugee infrastructures.
And this reflects well with writing yourself into the history, you know, reclaiming that memory of a place and displacing it in the discourse. I'm very much look forward to reading your memoir, Ervin. But this brings us to the last question of this thought enticing conversation. And that is a question that I ask every guest. And the question is, if you could bring one thing from Bosnia or the Balkans to the US, Canada, what would it be?
So I was gonna ask you actually, do other people tell you that this is probably one of the most challenging questions that you ask? Because I listened to all of the podcasts because I'm a huge fan. I want to make sure I say that again. And I feel like everyone has these extremely eloquent answers and responses. And I always like to think that it was probably one of the most challenging things that they had.
If it makes you feel better or comfortable, I don't myself have an answer to this.
It was such a generative question though, because for me it became a question about it was like a community thing. So like I went around, like for instance, I asked my partner, I'm like, so Rina is gonna ask me this. What do you think about this? And then I talked to my parents. I'm like, oh, you know, like what would you say to this? You know? And nobody had a good answer, you know? And I think it's more of a process question than it is a question that wants a particular answer. But I do want to give one answer to it, which is that, you know, I think quite fondly of my grandmother's garden that I mentioned earlier. And it is a place, it's an actual place. And I think that place is a place of the past, if that makes sense. So it exists today. It's in neglected form because no one's tending to it. But I wish I could bring it with me wherever I go so I could tend to it. Or maybe let's put it this way, like if it doesn't have to be a physical place, you know, if it's like a thing of the mind, then I'd like to think that I'm doing that type of work of tending to the garden, of tending to the good people that I care about, that I love on a daily basis. I very much hold this idea of my grandmother's garden in high esteem in my day-to-day life. And it's a thing that I think about a lot. So yeah, I would probably have to say my grandmother's garden.
And that's such a beautiful ending to this conversation. Thank you so much, Erwin, for being part of this project. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, your work, and your story with the audience of Diasporas Speaking.
Thank you so very much for hosting me.